In 1947, a teenage shepherd threw a stone into a cave. He was not looking for anything sacred. He was looking for a lost goat. The cliffs above the Dead Sea were pale and dry in the morning light, and the boy climbed without thinking, the way boys do when they are following an animal and not yet considering where the path is going. He threw the stone. He heard something break in the dark. It was not the sound of rock hitting rock. It was something different, something hollow, something that had been waiting a very long time to be disturbed. He did not go in that day. He came back with a friend, and when they finally ducked through the low opening and let their eyes adjust to the dark, they found tall clay jars lining the walls. Most were empty or filled with dirt, but two of them held something wrapped in linen, brown and stiff with age. They did not know what they were holding. Nobody alive did. Tonight, we are going to walk into that cave together. We are going to follow those scrolls from the hands of a teenage boy who did not know what he had found through the most contested and celebrated archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and all the way to the questions those ancient writings are still asking of anyone willing to listen. You do not need to know anything coming in. You only need to be here, breathing, willing to follow the sound of something breaking open in the dark. The night is long. The scrolls have been waiting 2,000 years. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shepherd Boy and the Broken Jar. His name was Muhammad Adib. He was 15 years old, or thereabouts. Nobody recorded his exact age, and he himself may not have known it with precision. What we know is that he was a member of the Ta'amira Bedouin tribe, that he had been tending goats in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, and that on a morning in the early weeks of 1947, one of his animals wandered off. The cliffs in that region are not gentle. They are a landscape that does not apologize for itself. Pale limestone faces dropping sharply toward the blue-gray surface of the Dead Sea, the lowest point on the surface of the earth, 430 meters below sea level. The air is dry in a way that is almost aggressive. The sun reflects off the rock and off the water simultaneously, so that even on a cool morning you feel the heat coming from two directions at once. Muhammad climbed. That is what shepherds do. You follow the animal, and you trust your feet on the rock, and you do not think too much about where the path is going. He found the cave opening almost by accident. A dark gap in the pale cliff face, low enough that he would have to duck to enter. He threw a stone in, the way you do when you are not sure what is inside. Not brave, not afraid. Just a boy checking a cave the way boys have always checked caves, with a thrown rock and a moment of listening. The sound he heard was not what he expected. It was a sharp crack, followed by a kind of hollow resonance. Not rock hitting rock. Something harder but more fragile. Something made... He did not go in alone. He went back to camp, told another boy named Jumar what he had found, and the two of them returned. Some accounts say they went back the same day. Others say it was the following morning. The details of that particular morning are the kind that get reshaped each time a person tells a story that turns out to matter more than they realized when they were living it. What is not disputed is what they found inside. The cave was roughly 8 meters long and perhaps 2 meters wide. The floor was uneven. The walls curved inward at the top, the way limestone caves do when they were formed by water moving through rock a very long time ago. Along the walls, embedded in the sediment of the floor, were tall cylindrical jars. Most scholars who later examined the site counted somewhere between 40 and 50. Most of them were broken, or empty, or packed with wind-blown dirt that had filtered in over centuries. But 2 of the jars were intact, and inside them, wrapped in linen cloth darkened and stiffened with age, were the scrolls. The boys took them. That is what happened. They did not know they were standing in the middle of the most significant biblical discovery in a century. They were teenagers who had found something strange, and they took it, the way people take things they do not yet understand. hoping that understanding will come later. The scrolls sat in their tent for weeks. The linen smelled of something old and mineral. The leather was dark and cracked at the edges. One of the adults in the camp eventually arranged to have the material evaluated in Bethlehem, then in Jerusalem. The first scholar to examine them was shown 3 scrolls and initially dismissed them. Then a second scholar looked more carefully. Then a third. Within 2 years, the academic world was in a state of barely controlled excitement. The scrolls included a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, older by 1,000 years than any previously known Hebrew manuscript of that text. They included a commentary on the Book of Habakkuk. They included a document nobody had seen before, written in Hebrew, describing the rules and practices of a religious community that had apparently lived in the desert. But Cave 1, as it came to be known, was only the beginning. Over the next 9 years, 11 caves in the same cliff system, above a site called Khirbet Qumran, were systematically searched and excavated. Each one yielded fragments. Cave 4 alone, a cavity hollowed into the soft marl of the cliff face close to the settlement, contained the remains of more than 500 separate manuscripts. Not full scrolls, mostly. The fragments were small, some of them no larger than a postage stamp, torn and crumbling, and bearing only a few legible words. But there were so many of them that scholars spent decades working out which fragment belonged to which manuscript, the way you would work out a puzzle with no picture on the box, in a language you are still learning, with pieces that kept disintegrating under your fingers. The total yield of all 11 caves was somewhere between 800 and 900 manuscripts, depending on how you count. Texts from almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, texts from books known but never before seen in Hebrew, texts from books nobody had heard of at all. And underneath all of it, the same question that Muhammad ad-Dib had accidentally cracked open on that pale morning in 1947. Who put these here? And why did they never come back? The answer to that question begins not in the cave, but in the ruins of a settlement at the base of the cliff, a few hundred meters from the water's edge. A place called Qumran, where the people who made the scrolls had lived and prayed and copied out their texts by lamplight and waited for something they believed was coming. They waited a long time. What came was not what they hoped for. But they left the words behind, sealed in clay, wrapped in linen, hidden in the dark. And 2,000 years later, a boy who was looking for a lost goat found them. There is a word in Hebrew that appears repeatedly in the oldest of those scrolls, a word that the community at Qumran used to describe the quality they were trying to build their entire lives around. The word is emet. It is usually translated as truth, but its root meaning reaches deeper than that. Firmness, reliability, the quality of being present in the same way, in the same place, doing the same faithful thing, regardless of what the circumstances around you are doing. The emet of those jars, sealed against the desert air for 2,000 years, is how the words survived. And the emet of a teenage shepherd who followed a lost goat into an unexpected part of the cliff is how they were found. Both kinds of faithfulness were necessary, the patient kind and the accidental kind, the deliberate preservation and the unplanned discovery. That is usually how it goes with the things that matter most. The great arrivals almost never announce themselves. They come through the ordinary action of someone who was not looking for them, at a moment that did not feel significant until later, by means of something as unremarkable as a thrown stone. Rest for a moment. Let your breathing slow. The cliffs above the Dead Sea are pale in the moonlight right now, exactly as they were on that morning in 1947. The same rock, the same silence, the same dry air that kept the jars intact across 2 millennia. We have only just arrived at the edge of the story, and there is so much more ahead. Chapter 2. The Community at the Edge of the Desert. Before we can understand what was in the scrolls, we have to understand who made them. This is the part of the story that most people skip or treat too briefly. They want to get to the contents, to the question of what the scrolls say about the Bible and about Jesus and about the things that scholars have argued over for 70 years. And those questions are coming. We will get to all of them. But if you skip the community, you miss everything that makes the scrolls more than a historical curiosity. You miss the reason the texts feel the way they feel. You miss the thing that makes a person lying in the dark tonight feel, against all logic, that these words were somehow written for them. So let us take our time here. The site of Qumran sits on a narrow plateau at the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, at the base of the cliffs where the caves are. The plateau rises slightly above the shoreline, commanding a view of the water to the east and the cliff face to the west. The landscape is not beautiful in the way that landscapes are usually called beautiful. It does not have the lushness of a valley or the drama of a mountain. It has something else. A severity, a stillness, the kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel against your skin when the wind drops. The settlement that archaeologists uncovered there was occupied, with some interruptions, from roughly the 2nd century before Christ until the year 68 of the Common Era, when the Roman army arrived and ended it. At its height, the community that lived there probably numbered somewhere between 100 and 200 people. They shared meals in a large communal room. They had an elaborate water system, a network of channels and cisterns carved into the plateau, capable of holding hundreds of thousands of liters, fed by a seasonal stream from the cliffs above. They had a long, narrow room where, scholars believe, at least some of the scrolls were copied, the dried inkwells and writing benches still visible in the ruins 2,000 years later. They had left Jerusalem. That was the essential fact about them. They had left on purpose. To understand why, you have to understand what Jerusalem was in the 2nd century before Christ. The city was not simply a religious center. It was a political one. The high priesthood, which controlled the temple and therefore the entire religious economy of Jewish life, had become entangled with political power in ways that many deeply observant Jews found intolerable. Foreign rulers had intervened in the appointment of high priests. Men had purchased the office. The sacred calendar, the precise ordering of feast days and Sabbaths and new moons that governed the rhythm of Jewish worship, had become a matter of political negotiation rather than divine command. For some people, this was a compromise they could live with. They stayed in Jerusalem. They worked within the system. They believed that imperfect faithfulness was still faithfulness. For others, it was not a compromise they could make, and the people who eventually settled at Qumran were among those others. The group most scholars associate with the Qumran community is a movement known as the Essenes. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the Essenes with evident admiration. They numbered in the thousands, he says, spread across Judea but concentrated in certain communities. They rejected personal wealth. They shared everything. They bathed frequently in cold water for ritual purification. They rose before dawn to pray. They studied their texts with an intensity that Josephus describes as remarkable even to an outside observer. What drove the specific community at Qumran into the desert was, most scholars believe, a dispute about the priesthood and the calendar. Their own texts refer to a figure they call the teacher of righteousness, a priest who had been wrongfully removed from his position by someone they call the wicked priest, and who led his followers into the wilderness to preserve the true interpretation of the law. The teacher of righteousness is never named in the scrolls. We do not know with certainty who he was, but his influence saturates the documents the community left behind. They quote him. They interpret scripture through his lens. They believe that God revealed to him truths about the meaning of the prophets that had not been revealed to anyone before him. They went into the desert because they believed the desert was where faithfulness still existed in its undiluted form. The connection was not accidental. The Hebrew prophets had spoken of the wilderness as the place where God's people would be renewed, where they would hear his voice again after a long silence. Isaiah had written of a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. The community at Qumran believed they were that voice. They believed they were the preparation. Their daily life had a structure that is almost impossible to imagine sustaining, and yet they sustained it for nearly 2 centuries. They woke before dawn. Morning prayer was followed by work, the kind of practical communal labor that keeps a settlement functioning in a desert environment. Midday brought more study. The communal meal in the evening was treated with the solemnity of a sacred rite. Bread was blessed and broken. The meal was eaten in silence or accompanied by the reading of texts. After the meal, more study, late into the night. Membership in the community was not taken lightly. A person who wished to join went through a process that took 2 years. In the first year, they were permitted to live alongside the community and observe, but they did not eat with them, and their property remained their own. In the second year, if the community voted to accept them, they began participating in the communal meals, but still retained their property. Only at the end of the second year, if a final vote confirmed their acceptance, did they transfer everything they owned to the community pool and become full members. The community rule, one of the scrolls found in Cave 1, describes in careful detail what happened if a member violated the community's standards. Interrupting another member during a session of community study resulted in a 10-day reduction in food rations. Speaking foolishly resulted in 30 days. Lying about property resulted in exclusion from the communal meal for 6 months. These were not invented problems. A community that felt the need to write down a rule against foolish laughter had almost certainly dealt with the disruption that foolish laughter causes when everyone is trying to hold on to something serious in the middle of a difficult world. There is something about this community that matters even more than their discipline. Something that the archaeological record makes quietly clear and that the scrolls themselves confirm. They were afraid, not of ordinary dangers, not of the desert or the heat or the difficulty of their lives. They were afraid of something they could see happening around them and could not stop. They watched the world they had grown up in, the world organized around the covenant between God and his people, being dismantled piece by piece. The priesthood corrupted, the calendar overwritten, the sacred texts interpreted by people with political interests rather than faithful ones. So they went to the edge. They went to the place where they could still do what they believed they were supposed to do, without compromise, for as long as they had. And they wrote it all down. They wrote it down because they believed that what they knew needed to outlast them. Their texts reveal a community that believed it was living in the final era before a great conflict that would end history as they knew it. They did not know when it was coming, but they believed they were preparing for it with every text they copied and every rule they followed and every pre-dawn prayer they offered into the cold desert air. The writing was the preparation. The library was the testimony. When the Roman army arrived in 68 of the Common Era, marching south from Jericho and sweeping through the settlements along the way, the community at Qumran had perhaps days, perhaps hours, to decide what to do with 2 centuries of accumulated texts. They put them in jars. They sealed the jars. They carried them up the cliffs and hid them in the caves. And then they did not come back. We do not know exactly what happened to them. The settlement shows evidence of violent destruction at a level that matches the period of the Roman advance. Some may have fled south. Some may have joined defenders at other fortresses. Some may simply have been killed where they stood. What we know is that for nearly 2,000 years, no human hand disturbed those jars, until a boy who was looking for a lost goat threw a stone into the dark and heard something break. There is something worth sitting with before we go further. These people built their whole lives around the conviction that truth needed to be preserved at any cost. They organized their mornings and their meals and their finances and their relationships around that conviction. They spent decades copying texts by lamplight in a desert settlement because they believed the words were worth more than the comfort of living somewhere easier. And then they gave up their lives and trusted the words to the dark. That kind of faithfulness does not ask for anything from you tonight. It does not need your agreement or your admiration. It just sits there in the historical record, quietly asking one question. What do you believe is worth preserving? And what are you willing to do to preserve it? The night is generous. Take your time with that. Chapter 3. 11 Caves, 900 Manuscripts. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not the story of a single discovery. That is the part that surprises most people when they first encounter it. They imagine one cave, one set of jars, one dramatic morning in the desert. The image is clean and satisfying, the way origin stories usually are. A boy, a stone, a crack in the cliff face, and suddenly the ancient world gives up its secret. But that is not what happened. What happened was slower, stranger, and in many ways more extraordinary than a single discovery could ever be. What happened was 11 caves, found over 9 years, by an unlikely combination of Bedouin tribesmen, competitive archaeologists, a Jordanian army officer, a group of scholars who disagreed about almost everything, and the particular quality of desert air that keeps leather intact for 2 millennia. Cave 1 was found in 1947, but the significance of what it contained was not immediately clear to the outside world. The scrolls moved through several hands before reaching scholars who could evaluate them properly. Some were purchased by a Syrian Orthodox archbishop. Some were acquired by a Hebrew university professor. The process was slow, complicated by the political situation of the region, which was itself in the middle of a transformation that would change the map of the Middle East permanently. By 1949, the location of Cave 1 had been identified by archaeologists from the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, and a proper excavation had been carried out. What they found confirmed what the scrolls themselves had suggested. The jars were purpose-made for scroll preservation, tall and cylindrical with fitted lids sealed against the dry desert air. This was not accidental preservation. Someone had worked to make it last. But Cave 1 had yielded only 7 major scrolls and a collection of smaller fragments. And the question that serious scholars were already asking, quietly at first and then more urgently, was whether there were other caves. The answer came not from the archaeologists but from the Bedouin. The Tarmire tribe, the same group that had produced Muhammad ad-Dib, had understood something that the academic world took longer to grasp. The cliffs above Qumran were riddled with cave openings. There were hundreds of them, some barely large enough to crawl into, some opening into chambers 30 or 40 meters deep. If one cave had held scrolls, others might too. And the scrolls, as the Bedouin had already discovered, had monetary value as antiquities that scholars and institutions were willing to pay for. They began searching systematically in a way that the archaeologists, with their limited funding and competing priorities, could not match. They knew the terrain. They had grown up in it. They moved through the cliffs with a speed and efficiency that no outside team could replicate. Cave 2 was found by Bedouin searchers in 1952. It contained fragments of texts from the Hebrew Bible and fragments of the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. Those ancient texts we have explored together on other nights from this channel. The Jubilees fragments alone were significant. Here were pieces of the same text in the original Hebrew that the Ethiopian church had been preserving in translation for 16 centuries. 2 traditions, the desert caves and the highland monasteries, confirmed as preserving the same words across 2,000 years. Cave 3 was found by archaeologists the same year. It contained a small number of biblical fragments and one object unlike anything found in any other cave. A scroll made not of leather or papyrus but of copper. rolled into two sections, too brittle to unroll without destroying it. It would take years before a team could cut it into strips thin enough to read. What they found inside is one of the most discussed and debated documents in the entire collection, and we will spend time with it later in this journey. Cave 4 was found in September of 1952, and Cave 4 changed everything. It was not an impressive cave, physically. It was a cavity hollowed into the soft marl of the cliff face, close to the Qumran settlement itself. What was inside was not intact scrolls. It was fragments. Thousands upon thousands of fragments scattered across the floor, mixed with the sediment of 2,000 years of wind and animal activity. The jars that had once held them had collapsed or been disturbed by time. What remained was a puzzle of a scale that nobody had anticipated. The number of individual manuscript fragments recovered from Cave 4 is estimated at somewhere around 15,000. Those 15,000 fragments, when scholars eventually began sorting and matching them, turned out to represent close to 600 separate manuscripts, with some scholarly estimates running higher. From nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, from texts that had been known only in translation until that moment, from texts that nobody had read since the 1st century of the Common Era. The physical process of recovery was itself a kind of archaeology of human endurance. Fragments were purchased from the Bedouin who had found them, matched with other fragments, photographed under controlled conditions, and placed in labeled boxes. Scholars worked on their knees on long tables, holding fragments up to the light, squinting at characters written in an ink that had faded from black to dark brown over 20 centuries. Some fragments were no larger than a thumbnail. Some bore only 2 or 3 legible letters. Each one mattered. Each one was a piece of something that had once been whole. Caves 5 through 10 were found in the years following 1952, some by Bedouin, some by archaeologists. Each added something to the portrait. Cave 11 was the last major discovery, found in 1956. After Cave 4, it was the most significant. It contained a nearly complete scroll of Psalms and the Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at nearly 9 meters, describing an idealized temple and its rituals in extraordinary detail. 9 years. 11 caves. Somewhere between 800 and 900 manuscripts. To put that in perspective, before 1947, the oldest known complete Hebrew manuscript of the Old Testament was a codex copied in the year 1008 of the Common Era. The Dead Sea Scrolls pushed that date back 1,000 years, in a single decade of searching. 1,000 years of textual transmission suddenly had a witness. What that witness revealed was remarkable. The texts were, in almost all essential respects, the same as the later manuscripts. Not identical. There were differences, and scholars have spent decades analyzing them with great care. But the differences were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, minor. Spelling variations. Small additions or omissions. Words that differed in detail but not in meaning. No major theological claim of any biblical book was altered by any variant found in the caves. The substance held, the message held, the story held. There is a woman named Patricia. She taught high school English for 30 years in Ohio, teaching students how to hold a source with appropriate respect and appropriate skepticism simultaneously. She read about the textual comparison between the scrolls and later manuscripts one winter and stopped at that chapter for a long time. She wrote in the margin of her book, "This is what faithful transmission looks like." She is right, and the scrolls are the evidence. But the collection is not only about confirming what was already known. A significant portion of the scrolls, perhaps a third of the total, consists of texts that were not part of the standard biblical canon. Texts that had been known in other languages but never seen in Hebrew. Texts that had been lost entirely. texts that existed nowhere else on Earth until that stone was thrown on a dry morning in 1947. Those texts tell a different kind of story. Not a story about transmission and preservation, but a story about the breadth and complexity of the religious world that produced both the scrolls and, a generation later, the New Testament. A world where the boundaries of the sacred library were still being defined, where multiple interpretations of the law existed simultaneously, where people were asking, with genuine urgency, the same questions that people are still asking tonight. Understanding that world does not diminish the texts that eventually became canonical. It does something more interesting. It shows you how wide the river was before it narrowed into the channel we have inherited. And it gives you a deeper appreciation for what was preserved and why it mattered enough to preserve. The caves were not a library that survived by accident. They were a library that survived because people believed, with everything they had, that some things are worth more than safety and more than comfort and more than the ordinary human preference for not carrying burdens that are heavier than you need to carry. They carried them anyway, up the cliff face, into the dark, and the dark kept them. 11 caves, 900 manuscripts, 2,000 years of silence, and a boy who was looking for something else entirely found the door that had been waiting for exactly the kind of person who was not trying to find it. That is the nature of this kind of discovery. It does not wait for the right expert. It waits for the right moment. And the right moment arrives when it arrives through whatever ordinary action happens to be in progress at the time. Chapter 4. The Great Isaiah Scroll. When the Bible met itself. Of all the scrolls that came out of those 11 caves, one stands apart. Not because it is the oldest, though it is among the oldest. Not because it is the most contested, though scholars have pored over it with the kind of attention usually reserved for legal documents and love letters. It stands apart because of what it is, in the simplest possible terms. It is a complete book of the Bible, written on leather, 2,100 years old, preserved so well that you can read it under normal light, without enhancement, without reconstruction, without filling in missing letters from context. It is the Great Isaiah Scroll, and the story of what it tells us, not just about the prophet Isaiah, but about the entire question of whether the Bible we hold today is the Bible that existed 2,000 years ago, is one of the most quietly astonishing stories in the history of human knowledge. Let us start with the physical object, because it earns its own description. The Great Isaiah Scroll is 7.3 meters long. That is nearly 24 feet of prepared leather, 17 separate sheets stitched together at the edges with linen thread, covered on one side with 54 columns of carefully written Hebrew text. The letters are dense and even, the work of a scribe who had been doing this for years, whose hand was steady and whose concentration was deep. There are occasional corrections. Places where a letter was written incorrectly and scraped away, or where a word was omitted and added above the line in a smaller hand. These small human errors, preserved in the leather for 2,100 years, make the scroll feel inhabited in a way that a perfect text could not. Someone was here. Someone held this pen. Someone made a mistake and fixed it. The scroll contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah without interruption. No pages missing. No columns destroyed. Scholars have identified two main scribal hands in the text, suggesting that two different people worked on it, one taking over from the other partway through. The transition is so smooth that a casual reader would not notice it. Two scribes, trained in the same tradition, maintaining the same care across the full length of a scroll that would have taken months to complete. The scroll was found in Cave 1 in 1947, among the first scrolls recovered. It eventually made its way to a bank vault in New Jersey, the oldest known complete Hebrew manuscript of any biblical book, waiting in a safe deposit box, while its owner placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal seeking a buyer. that detail never loses its strangeness. The most significant Hebrew manuscript in the world, sitting in New Jersey, for sale. In 1954, the scroll was purchased on behalf of the State of Israel and returned to Jerusalem, where it has been housed in a specially designed underground vault at the Israel Museum ever since, in a room called the Shrine of the Book, built in a shape that echoes the lid of the scroll jars in which it was found. But the scroll's most important contribution to human knowledge is not about its physical preservation or its unlikely journey. Its most important contribution is what happens when you compare it, line by line, to the book of Isaiah as it appears in modern Bibles. The standard Hebrew text that underlies most modern translations of the Old Testament belongs to what scholars call the Masoretic tradition, a system of careful scribal transmission, whose earliest complete surviving manuscript dates to the year 1008 of the Common Era. For centuries, scholars had no way to verify whether this tradition accurately represented what the biblical books had looked like 1,000 years earlier. The great Isaiah scroll gave them a witness from that earlier period. And what they found, when they laid the two texts side by side, was this. The scroll belongs to what textual scholars call a proto-Masoretic tradition. The overwhelming majority of its text agrees with the later Masoretic manuscripts. Most scholarly measures place the level of agreement very high, somewhere in the range of 95%. The differences that exist are almost entirely matters of spelling, scribal habit, and minor wording. Scholars who have studied both texts in careful detail have found that no major theological claim of the book of Isaiah is altered by any variant between the two. The word the scribal tradition used for this work of faithful transmission was Mesora, which gives us the English term Masoretic. But Mesora means more than tradition. Its root means handing over, passing from hand to hand with deliberate care, like a flame carried from one lamp to another so that the light does not go out. The scribes who produced the Masoretic tradition were not passive copyists. They were active guardians. They counted the letters in each book of the Bible and recorded the totals, so that any copy that deviated from the correct count could be identified and corrected. They noted the middle letter of each book, the middle word, the middle verse. They marked unusual spellings and grammatical forms with notations in the margin, flags to future copyists that this particular word was to be copied exactly as written, even if it looked like an error. They developed an entire system of careful notation devoted to the single purpose of making sure that nothing changed. The great Isaiah scroll, written 1,000 years before the Masoretic manuscripts by people who had not yet developed the full apparatus of that notation, validates their work. It shows that the text the Masoretes were so carefully preserving was, in all its essential features, the same text that the Qumran community had copied and sealed in a jar in the 1st century before Christ. The light did not go out. There is a man named Thomas. He is 44 years old, and he grew up in a household where the Bible was read every morning at breakfast, a chapter before the day began, without discussion or commentary, just the words read aloud in the same translation his grandfather had used. He left that practice in his 20s, when his relationship with faith became more complicated. He did not stop believing exactly, but he became uncertain in ways he had not been as a child, and the uncertainty was uncomfortable to carry in a tradition that did not always leave room for it. He heard about the Isaiah scroll comparison in a podcast several years ago and looked it up afterward. He sat with what he found for a long time. 1,000 years of hand copying across political upheaval and exile and diaspora and persecution, and the complete reorganization of the Jewish world after the destruction of the temple. And the text arrived essentially intact. He did not know exactly what to do with that, but it settled something in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Not the theological questions. Those remained as complicated as ever. But something about the care, the deliberateness of it, The fact that somewhere, in every century between the Qumran scribe and the Masoretic copyist, there had been a person who believed the words were worth counting. He called his father that evening. They talked for an hour. The scroll was in the background of the conversation, the way some discoveries are, present without being named. The Great Isaiah Scroll is now available to view in its entirety online, in high-resolution photography that allows you to zoom in on individual letters, to see the places where the scribe's hand hesitated, to read the marginal corrections in the smaller handwriting of someone who came after and noticed what needed fixing. There is something about seeing the actual letters, the ink that a human hand applied to leather 2100 years ago, that makes the distance collapse in a way that translation cannot quite achieve. You are not reading about the scroll. You are looking at the same marks that the scribe looked at when he lifted his pen and reviewed what he had written, checking it against the text he was copying, satisfying himself that he had gotten it right. He got it right. And the tradition he was part of got it right, generation after generation, in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. War, exile, persecution, the burning of libraries, the disappearance of communities, the loss of languages, the ordinary entropy of time, which destroys almost everything given long enough. Almost everything. Not this. There is something in the survival of the Great Isaiah Scroll that goes beyond the scholarly significance of a textual comparison. It is the feeling, when you sit with it long enough, that you are in the presence of something that was meant to outlast the people who made it. That the care those people poured into its creation was itself a kind of prayer, an act of faith directed not at the past, but at the future, at people they would never meet, in circumstances they could not imagine, who would need the words. They did not know you, but you are the reason the words were worth counting. You are the end point of a chain of faithfulness so long that its beginning disappears into the ancient world. And tonight, the Isaiah Scroll has found its way to you. Breathe. Let that in slowly. The words survived. The chain held. And the scroll, after 2100 years, is still saying what it was always saying. Let it say it to you tonight, in this quiet, before the sleep comes. Chapter 5. The Rule of the Community. How they lived. There is a document among the Dead Sea Scrolls that most casual readers overlook. Not because it is unimportant, quite the opposite. It is one of the most complete and carefully written texts in the entire collection, preserved in multiple copies, clearly central to the life of the community that produced it. But it does not have the romantic appeal of a prophecy or the mystery of an unknown text. It does not raise dramatic questions about the boundaries of the biblical canon or the reliability of ancient transmission. It is, in the plainest possible terms, a rule book. And yet, if you spend time with it, really spend time with it, it becomes something more than a rule book. It becomes a window into the daily life of people who decided that the gap between what they believed and how they lived was a gap they were no longer willing to tolerate. People who sat down together and asked a question that most communities, ancient or modern, find too uncomfortable to ask seriously. What would it actually look like to organize a human life around what we say we believe? The document is called the Serich HaYahad in Hebrew. The word Yahad means togetherness or unity in the deepest sense. Not merely a group of people who share a geography or an affiliation, but people who have chosen, deliberately and at cost, to become something together that they could not be separately. The Yahad was not a casual association. It was a total reorientation of life. The rule of the community found in Cave 1 is the most complete copy, though fragments of at least 10 other copies were found in other caves, suggesting that this document was in active use across the community's history, copied and recopied as new members joined and the community's practices evolved. It covers everything from the theology that underpinned the community's existence to the specific penalties for specific violations. It begins with purpose. Before it tells anyone what to do, it tells them why. The purpose of the community, according to the rule, was to seek God with a whole heart and soul, to do what is good and right before him, as he commanded through Moses and through all his servants the prophets, to love everything he has chosen and hate everything he has rejected, to distance oneself from all evil and to hold fast to all good deeds. That is the charter. Everything else flows from it. The process of joining was a 2-year journey that left nothing to chance. In the first year, a candidate lived alongside the community and observed, but did not eat with them, and their property remained their own. In the second year, if the community voted to accept them, they participated in the communal meals, but still retained their property. Only at the end of the second year, if a final vote confirmed their acceptance, did they transfer everything they owned to the community pool and become full members. The transfer of property was not incidental. It was the physical enactment of the theological commitment. You could not half join the Yahad. The commitment was total or it was nothing. Once a full member, each person participated in the annual review. Every year, each member was evaluated and assigned a rank. A member who had grown in wisdom and faithfulness over the year might rise. A member who had fallen short might fall. This was not punitive in intention. It was diagnostic. The community asking together, who are we becoming, and whether we are becoming it faithfully. The penalty system described in the rule is the section that modern readers often find most striking. Lying about property resulted in exclusion from the communal meal for 1 full year. Speaking without being recognized to speak in the formal assembly resulted in a 10-day penalty. Laughing in a way that disrupted the assembly carried 30 days. The specificity of these rules tells you something important. These were not invented problems. These were the solutions to real situations that real people had created by behaving in ways that made communal life harder than it needed to be. And there is a detail in the rule that scholars have found particularly significant, a detail that connects the life of the Qumran community to a practice that would become central to early Christianity. The communal meal. The rule describes the meal in careful terms. When the table has been set and the new wine prepared, the priest shall stretch out his hand first to pronounce a blessing over the first portion of the bread and the new wine. In the community's meal, the priest acts first. He blesses the bread. He blesses the wine. And only after his blessing do the other members partake. A second document in the collection, known as the Rule of the Congregation, describes a more eschatological version of this same meal, a meal set in the end times, presided over by the Messiah. When the Messiah enters, the priests shall sit first, and then the Messiah, and then the rest of the congregation. And the priest shall stretch forth his hand to bless the bread and wine first. Scholars who have studied the earliest Christian sources, including the accounts of the Last Supper in the Gospels and the description of the Lord's Supper in the letters of Paul, have noted the structural similarity with a care that goes beyond casual observation. The same gestures, the same order. Bread blessed and broken, wine blessed and shared. A leader acting first on behalf of the community. This does not mean that the Last Supper was simply a Qumran meal with different participants. The theological meaning that the Gospels attach to what Jesus did at that final meal is specific and irreducible. But it does mean that when Jesus took bread and broke it, he was doing something in a ritual language that the people around the table already spoke. He was taking a form they knew and filling it with a meaning that would take the rest of human history to fully understand. Now here is the detail that most people miss entirely, the detail that stops you when you encounter it for the first time and makes you sit quietly for a moment with what it means. The Qumran community ate this meal every single evening, not on feast days, not on Sabbath only. Every evening, 150 people in a desert settlement, some of them former priests from Jerusalem, some of them young men who had left comfortable lives to live in the wilderness, some of them people who had been in the community for decades, and some who had been there for months, all of them sitting down together in that long communal room as the sun dropped behind the western cliffs and the shadows over the Dead Sea grew long and blue and the stars came out one by one above the desert. Every evening, the bread, the wine, the blessing, the silence, for nearly 200 years. Think about what that means, not as theology, just as a human fact. Think about the number of evenings that represents. Think about the people who sat down at that table when they were young and idealistic and full of certainty, and the people who were still sitting down at it 30 years later, slower and more weathered, with fewer certainties, but perhaps a deeper kind of faith. Think about the evenings when someone was missing because they were sick, and the evenings when a new member joined the table for the first time and the community made room. Think about the last evening, the evening when the bread was blessed and the wine was shared, and nobody knew it was the last time. That detail changes the communal meal from a historical curiosity into something you can feel, into something that a person lying in the dark tonight, at whatever hour this has become, can recognize from the inside. There is a woman named Margaret. She has been a hospital chaplain for 18 years in a city in Minnesota. She sits with people at the ends of their lives, in the hours when the ordinary structures of daily existence fall away, and what remains is something more essential. She told a colleague once that the thing she notices most at the end is not the dramatic moments. It is the daily ones. The people who say, in those last hours, I wish I had eaten more dinners slowly. I wish I had stayed at the table longer. She read about the Qumran communal meal in a book on Second Temple Judaism, and something in the description stayed with her for days. She could not entirely say why, only that it had something to do with the fact that those people had understood, before the last evening arrived, that the meal itself was the point, not preparation for something more important. The meal itself, every evening, for 200 years. The rule of the community is, at its heart, a manual for not missing the meal, not for heroes, not for people with extraordinary gifts or extraordinary faith, for people who had decided that the ordinary faithfulness of one more day, one more evening at the table, one more morning prayer in the cold desert air, was the thing that held everything else together. That kind of faithfulness does not announce itself. It just continues, until it cannot continue any longer. And then the words it lived by get sealed in a jar and carried up a cliff face and trusted to the dark. Chapter 6. The War Scroll. Darkness before the dawn. Not all of the Dead Sea Scrolls are peaceful. That is something worth acknowledging before we go further. The portrait of the Qumran community that emerges from the rule of the community is one of discipline and study and communal care, of people who organize their days around prayer and their evenings around shared meals and their years around careful self-examination. And that portrait is accurate, as far as it goes. But there is another document in the collection that shows a different face of the same community, a face that is harder to sit with, that requires more context to understand, and that, once understood, reveals something about the human experience of faith in dark times that is more honest than most religious texts allow themselves to be. The document is called the Megillat Ha-Milhama in Hebrew, the War Scroll. It was found in Cave 1 among the first scrolls recovered in 1947. A second copy, more fragmentary, was found later in Cave 4. The main copy runs to 19 columns of text, though the original document was almost certainly longer, with portions no longer preserved. It is written in a clear, assured hand, suggesting a scribe who knew this text well enough that the words came without hesitation. What it describes is a war, the final war, the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a cosmic conflict that the community believed would end history as they knew it and inaugurate a new age under the direct reign of God. Let us sit with that for a moment before we go into the details, because the temptation, when modern readers encounter apocalyptic literature like this, is to categorize it quickly and move on, to file it under a familiar heading and feel that you have understood it. That categorization is easy. It is also wrong. The War Scroll is not a fantasy of violence. It is not the product of people who wanted to harm anyone. It is the product of people who had watched the world they loved be systematically destroyed, who had no political power and no institutional allies, and who found, in the ancient prophetic tradition of their faith, a framework for understanding their situation that did not require them to pretend the destruction was not real, or that the people causing it would not ultimately be held accountable, or that the darkness they were living through was the last word. It is a theology of hope dressed in military language, and once you read it that way, it reads very differently. The conflict the scroll describes is 40 years long, not 40 continuous years of battle. The scroll divides the 40 years into alternating periods of warfare and sabbatical rest. 6 years of fighting, followed by 1 year of rest. Then more fighting, then more rest. Even the final cosmic conflict between light and darkness pauses, according to the War Scroll, to keep the commandment about the seventh day. This detail is not accidental, and it is not small. Think about what it means. The community that wrote the War Scroll believed they were describing the end of the world, and in their description of the end of the world, they built in the Sabbath. They could not imagine a reality, even a cosmic final reality, that did not observe the rhythm God had established at the beginning of creation. The sacred structure of time was not something they practiced until something more important came along. It was woven into the fabric of everything, including the fabric of the end. The adversaries in the War Scroll are identified with a precision that places the document firmly in a specific historical moment. The sons of darkness include the Kittim, a term the Qumran community used for the Romans, the army of the Western Sea that had extended its reach into Judea. They include various neighboring peoples, and they include, in passages that are among the most painful in the entire scroll, members of the Jewish community itself who had, in the community's view, accommodated the foreign powers at the cost of the covenant. That last detail is the one that requires the most honesty to sit with. The community at Qumran saw themselves as a faithful remnant, not only against Rome, but against the compromises of their own people. That self-understanding is uncomfortable. History is full of communities that believed they alone had maintained the original purity of the faith. Such communities have sometimes done serious harm in the name of that conviction. What makes the Qumran community different is what they actually did with it. They went to the desert. They built their cisterns and their communal dining room and their scriptorium. They copied scrolls. They prayed before dawn. They wrote down what they believed would eventually happen and left the execution of it entirely in the hands of God. The military detail in the War Scroll is extraordinary in a way that surprises most readers when they first encounter it. The troop formations, the arrangement of infantry and cavalry, the use of trumpets and standards for battlefield communication, the rotation of units to maintain fighting effectiveness, these correspond closely to the military practices of the Roman army in the 1st century before the Common Era. Scholars who have compared the War Scroll to Roman military manuals of the period have found the parallels too consistent to be accidental. The community at Qumran knew exactly what they were up against. They had studied the army that had displaced them. They understood its tactics with the same careful attention they brought to the sacred calendar and the precise interpretation of the law. Their retreat to the desert was not ignorance of the world. It was a fully informed choice, made with clear eyes, to live in a way that the world around them made difficult. Picture what that looked like on an ordinary afternoon. A scribe in the scriptorium bent over the long writing table, the lamplight steady because the air in the limestone plateau barely moves. The smell of ink drying on leather. Outside, the sound of the wind coming off the Dead Sea, the same sound every afternoon at the same hour, so familiar that it has long since disappeared into the background of the day. The scribe is copying the war scroll. He is writing words about a war he believes is coming. A war between everything he loves and the force that has already come once to threaten it. His hand is steady. The characters are even. He is not afraid of the words he is writing. He has made his peace with the darkness. He does not believe the darkness will not come. He believes it will come, and he is recording carefully and completely the reason why it is not the end of the story. The scroll also contains some of the most beautiful liturgical poetry in the entire Qumran collection. Before the battle begins, before any trumpet sounds, there is prayer. There is acknowledgement that the victory, if it comes, will not be the achievement of human valor. Blessed be the God of Israel, the scroll says, who keeps his covenant of mercy with our fathers, and who remembers his covenant of salvation with the people he has redeemed. That is not the language of people who believe the outcome depends on them. That is the language of people who believe they are participating in something larger than themselves, something that was in motion before they were born and will continue after they are gone, something they are called to be faithful to without being in control of. The darkness they described was real. The Roman army would arrive at Qumran within living memory of whoever wrote these words. The destruction they anticipated did come. Jerusalem fell in the year 70 of the Common Era. The temple was burned. The community was scattered or killed. From the outside, looking at the historical record, it is easy to see the war scroll as the document of people who were wrong, who believed a deliverance was coming that did not come, at least not in the form they expected. But there is another way to read it. They were not wrong that darkness comes. They were not wrong that the structures of power in the world are capable of destroying what is most sacred and most carefully tended. They were not wrong that there are moments when everything a community has built across generations can be swept away in a single season of violence. What they left behind, sealed in those jars, was their answer to that knowledge. Not an answer that pretended the destruction would not come. An answer that said, it may come, and when it does, these words will still be here, because we put them somewhere the darkness cannot reach. In the final weeks before the Roman legion arrived, someone in the Qumran community made a decision. We do not know who made it. We do not know whether it was the overseer, the figure the community rule calls the mebaka, or whether it was a decision made together by the full assembly. What we know is that the decision was made and the preparations had already been in place. The jars were brought out, the scrolls were wrapped. Perhaps someone read from the war scroll that evening at the communal meal. Perhaps someone prayed the prayer about the God who keeps his covenant of mercy. Someone blew out the lamp in the scriptorium for the last time and looked around the room at the writing tables and the inkwells and the small objects left behind by people who had worked there and would not return. And then they sealed the jars and climbed and trusted. The war scroll is not comfortable reading. It was not written to be comfortable. It was written by people who had looked at the world without flinching and found, in the ancient language of their faith, a way to hold the darkness honestly and keep showing up anyway. That is a different kind of courage from the courage of the finding. It is quieter. It does not announce itself. It just gets up in the morning and copies the next column and prays before dawn and eats the communal meal and seals the jar when the time comes. Rest now. You do not need to carry the weight of the war scroll into your sleep. You only need to carry the thing underneath it. The darkness does not get the last word. It never has. Not once in the entire length of this long and complicated story. Not tonight. Chapter 7. The night they sealed the jars. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with the weight they deserve. They do not feel, to the people living inside them, like the kind of moment that will be remembered. They feel like urgency and fear and the specific quality of attention that comes when you understand that the time for deliberation has passed and what remains is only the time for doing. The night the community at Qumran sealed their scrolls into clay jars and carried them up the cliff face was one of those moments. We do not know the exact date. We do not know the names of the people who did it. We do not know whether it was one night or several, whether it was done in panic or in the deliberate calm of people who had been preparing for this possibility for years. The archaeological record gives us the approximate period, the middle decades of the first century of the Common Era, the years when the first Jewish war against Rome was moving from a local uprising into a catastrophic confrontation that would end with Jerusalem in flames and the temple destroyed and the world that had produced the scrolls gone forever. What the record gives us is the jars, and the jars tell a story that words could not tell more clearly. The jars were not storage vessels repurposed for an emergency. They were made for this. The cylindrical jars found in the caves, tall and narrow with carefully fitted lids, match a type that archaeologists have not found in significant quantities anywhere else in the region. They were purpose-built for scroll preservation, designed with an understanding of what the desert climate required, what the limestone caves could provide, what would need to be true about the container if the contents were going to survive an indefinite period of abandonment. Someone at Qumran had thought about this before the emergency arrived. Someone had understood, perhaps years or decades before the Roman army appeared on the horizon, that a moment might come when the library would need to be hidden, and they had prepared for it. That preparation is one of the most quietly remarkable things about the entire story. In the middle of building a community, copying texts, organizing communal meals, reviewing annual rankings, praying before dawn, conducting the 1,000 practical tasks of daily life in a desert settlement, someone had also been thinking about what happened if it all had to end suddenly. Someone had been making jars. Picture the settlement in those final weeks. The community had existed for nearly 200 years at that point. The people living there were not the founders. They were the inheritors. They had grown up in the rhythms of the Yahad, had eaten its communal meals and sat in its assemblies and been evaluated in its annual reviews. The library they were preparing to hide was not abstract to them. It was the library of their community. The scrolls they were wrapping in linen were texts they had studied, texts they had copied, texts they had heard read aloud at the evening meal for as long as they could remember. The Roman 10th Legion had left Jericho and was moving south. The speed of a Roman military advance was organized and relentless. The communities in its path were given a choice that was not really a choice, and those who could not defend themselves were destroyed. Qumran could not defend itself. It was not a military settlement. It had no walls capable of withstanding a Roman assault. What it had was a library and a mission and 200 years of accumulated faithfulness, and none of those things slowed a legion. So they did what they could do. They gathered the scrolls. They wrapped them in linen cloth, the same linen that appears in fragments in the cave deposits, identifiable by its weave and its preservation across 2,000 years. They placed them in the jars. They fitted the lids. They sealed the seams with a care that the desert would honor for 2 millennia. And then they carried them up. The climb from the settlement to the cave openings in the cliff face is not trivial. The terrain is steep and loose in places, the kind of surface where you have to think about every step, where a jar that slipped from a tired grip would shatter on the rocks below. The caves are at different elevations. Getting there with arms full of clay jars, in whatever light was available, under whatever time pressure existed, was not easy. They did it anyway. We do not know how many people were involved. We do not know how many trips were made. We do not know whether the community had already begun to scatter before the hiding was complete, or whether they stayed until the last jar was placed and the last cave opening was left behind. The site shows evidence of violent destruction consistent with the Roman advance, which suggests that at least some members of the community were present when the army arrived. They did not come back for the scrolls. This is the fact that sits at the center of everything. The absence that makes the discovery possible and the story tragic simultaneously. They did not come back. The people who knew where the jars were, who could have walked straight to each cave without searching, who carried in their memories a map of everything they had hidden, never returned to retrieve it. There are two ways to understand this. The first is simply that they could not. The destruction was complete enough, the disruption of the war catastrophic enough, the scattering of the surviving community thorough enough, that the practical possibility of returning never materialized. The people who knew where the jars were died, or fled to places from which return was impossible, or found themselves in a world so transformed by violence and loss that the scrolls remained hidden not because anyone chose to leave them, but because the conditions for retrieval never existed again. The second way to understand it is that some of them always intended for the scrolls to wait. That the hiding was not merely a desperate emergency measure but a considered act of transmission, a deliberate decision to entrust the words to the desert and the dark rather than risk their destruction in the violence that was coming. That some of the people who carried those jars up the cliff face understood, or at least hoped, that what they were doing was not just hiding but sending. Sending across time to people they would never meet, in circumstances they could not predict, words they believed were worth the receiving. We cannot know which of these is true. Perhaps both are. Perhaps the people who sealed the jars were acting from pure survival instinct, saving what could be saved with no thought beyond the immediate crisis. And perhaps that instinct was itself a form of the faith they had spent their lives practicing, the deep conviction that these words had outlasted everything that had come before and would outlast whatever was coming now. There is a man named James. He is 58 years old, and he lives outside of Nashville, Tennessee. 8 months ago, he received a diagnosis that changed the way he moves through time. Not a death sentence, his doctors were careful to say that, but a serious illness, the kind that reorganizes your relationship to the future, that makes the horizon visible in a way it was not before. In the weeks after the diagnosis, he found himself doing something he had not done in years. He began writing, not a journal exactly, letters. Letters to his children, to his grandchildren who did not yet exist, to people he loved, who he was not certain he would have time to say everything to in the ordinary course of conversation. He wrote about what he believed and why. He wrote about what he had gotten wrong and what he had learned from getting it wrong. He wrote about the things he wanted them to know that he had never found a way to say out loud. He found the letters accumulating in a folder on his desk. One evening he mentioned them to a friend, and the friend asked what he was going to do with them. He said, "I am going to seal them and give them to my daughter to open when she thinks the time is right." His friend said, "You are making a time capsule." James said, "I am making a jar." He did not explain what he meant. He had been listening to something about the Dead Sea Scrolls the week before and had heard about the night Qumran was evacuated, about the people who climbed the cliff face with their arms full of clay and their library wrapped in linen. He understood something about them that he had not understood before. The sealing of the jar was not a resignation. It was not giving up. It was an act of hope, so specific and so deliberate that it required believing, without any evidence, in the existence of a future that you yourself might not be part of. You only bother to preserve something carefully if you believe there will be someone, somewhere, worth preserving it for. The people of Qumran believed there would be someone worth preserving it for. They were right. It took 2,000 years and a teenage shepherd and a broken jar and decades of scholarship and a night like this one. But they were right. Think about what it means that the first sound the scrolls made after 2,000 years of silence was the sound of a jar breaking. Not a dramatic announcement. Not a voice from heaven or a light in the sky or any of the signs by which important arrivals are supposed to make themselves known. Just a crack in the dark. A hollow resonance. A boy with a stone who was looking for something else entirely. That is usually how the important things arrive. Not announced, not dramatic. Through the ordinary action of a person who was not looking for what they found, in circumstances that did not feel significant until later, by means of something as unremarkable as a thrown stone. Rest now. Let the image of those sealed jars sit with you as you move toward sleep. Let the cliff face and the darkness and the linen-wrapped scrolls be present in whatever room you are resting in tonight. You have been carrying things today, things that feel heavy and things that feel uncertain and things that you are not sure you know how to put down. You do not have to put them down tonight if you are not ready. But consider this. The people who sealed those jars also carried things. They carried the weight of a world that was ending. They carried the grief of a community that had given everything to a way of life that was about to be destroyed. They carried the knowledge that what they were trying to preserve might not survive, that the jars might break or be found by people who did not understand what they held or simply sit in the dark until the leather crumbled to dust and the words disappeared with it. They carried all of that, and they sealed the jars anyway, because some things are worth the attempt even when the outcome is not guaranteed. Because the act of preservation is itself a statement about what you believe the future holds. Because you do not seal a jar carefully, you do not wrap the scrolls in linen and fit the lid and carry it up a cliff face in the dark, unless you believe there is something worth finding on the other side of the waiting. The jars held. The words survived. And tonight, in this quiet room, at this late hour, they reached you. That is not nothing. That is everything. Chapter 8. The Copper Scroll. The treasure that might be real. Not everything in the caves of Qumran fits neatly into the story we have been telling. The Dead Sea Scrolls collection is, in the main, a coherent archive. Biblical texts, community rules, hymns and prayers, commentaries on the prophets, war preparation documents. The texts fit together into a portrait of a specific religious community living a specific kind of life for specific theological reasons. When you spend time with the collection, a portrait emerges. Not a simple portrait, not without tensions and contradictions, but a recognizable one. And then there is the Copper Scroll. The Copper Scroll does not fit the portrait. It does not belong to the same genre as anything else in the collection. It raises questions that decades of scholarship have not resolved. It sits in the middle of the Dead Sea Scrolls story, like a room in a familiar house that leads somewhere you did not expect. A door that opens onto a staircase, going down into something older and stranger than the house you thought you knew. It was found in Cave 3 in 1952. Cave 3 was a modest find in most respects, containing fragments of texts already known from other caves. But at the back of the cave, the excavators found something unlike anything recovered from any of the other 10 caves. 2 rolled sections of corroded metal, copper as it turned out, each section roughly 30 centimeters wide, rolled so tightly that the interior was not visible, and the brittleness of the corroded metal made unrolling impossible without destroying it. The sections sat in storage for several years while scholars debated how to open them. In 1955, a team at the Manchester College of Technology in England used a specially designed circular saw to cut them lengthwise into strips, each one carefully numbered, to preserve the sequence. The cutting was done under conditions of controlled humidity to prevent further deterioration. It took months of careful work. When the strips were finally laid out in order and the text was readable, scholars found themselves looking at something that had no parallel in the rest of the collection. It was a list, 64 entries, each one describing a location and what was hidden there. The locations were described in terms of landmarks, distances, and directions. The contents were described in terms of weight and material: gold, silver, priestly vestments, scrolls, aromatics used in temple worship, containers of sacred objects. The quantities were extraordinary. The total amount of gold and silver described in the scroll, if you add up all 64 entries and convert the ancient weight measurements into modern equivalents, comes to somewhere in the range of 65 tons by most scholarly estimates. Some calculations run higher. The precise conversion is disputed, as is almost everything about this document. But the order of magnitude is consistent across different approaches to the calculation. 65 tons of gold and silver, buried in 64 locations across the landscape of ancient Judea, waiting to be found. If the copper scroll is accurate, that is the question that has driven treasure hunters and archaeologists and curious readers to distraction for 70 years. And the honest answer, after all that searching, is that nobody knows. The arguments for its genuineness are substantial. The quantities described, while enormous, are consistent with what ancient sources tell us about the temple treasury before its destruction. The historian Josephus describes the temple treasury in terms that suggest extraordinary wealth accumulated over centuries of donations from Jewish communities across the Roman world. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a financial institution of the ancient world. If the Roman army was approaching Jerusalem and the treasury needed to be hidden quickly, the quantities in the copper scroll are not inherently implausible. The use of copper rather than leather or papyrus also speaks in favor of genuineness. Copper is expensive. Copper is difficult to work with. Nobody in the ancient world chose copper as a writing surface for routine documents or liturgical texts. You chose copper when you needed something to last, when the information was too important to trust to organic materials that could deteriorate. The choice of copper is itself an argument. It says, "Whoever wrote this believed what they were recording was worth the extraordinary effort of recording it in metal." But the arguments against are also substantial. The amounts are, to some scholars, simply too large to be credible in practical terms. Moving 65 tons of precious metal in 64 separate operations in the middle of a military crisis strains the imagination past what the historical record can comfortably support. The writing style is also unlike the rest of the collection, more colloquial, more practical, less literary, which has led some scholars to suggest it was produced outside the Qumran community altogether, hidden in the cave by someone with no connection to the community that left everything else there. There is a third possibility, held by a minority of scholars but worth considering carefully. The copper scroll may be a genuine inventory of objects considered sacred but not literally made of precious metal. In some ancient Jewish texts, the language of treasure is used to refer to sacred texts themselves, to accumulated wisdom, to the teachings of revered masters. Under this reading, the 64 locations may mark not hiding places for gold, but repositories for sacred knowledge. Manuscripts, teachings, interpretations. Under this reading, the copper scroll is not a map to buried gold. It is a map to buried meaning. No one has found the treasure. 70 years of searching, some of it systematic and scholarly, some of it enthusiastic and amateur, has produced nothing. The locations that can be identified with reasonable confidence have been investigated. They have yielded nothing. The locations that remain ambiguous cannot be confidently matched to any known site. The treasure, if it exists in the literal sense, is still out there, or it was found centuries ago by someone who left no record, or it never existed in the form the scroll describes. What is not in dispute is the object itself. The copper scroll sits today in the Jordan Museum in Amman, displayed in a case that shows the strips cut in 1955, The ancient writing, still legible on the interior surfaces after 2,000 years of oxidation on the outside. Visitors walk past it and stop and lean toward the glass and wonder, the way everyone wonders, whether the treasure is real. But the object in the case is itself the answer to the question, regardless of what the text says. Somebody wrote this in copper. Somebody believed that what they were recording was worth the extraordinary effort and expense of recording it in metal that would last when everything else had crumbled. Somebody looked at the crisis they were living through and decided that the most important thing they could do with the time that remained was make sure that something survived. The copper held for 2,000 years in a cave in the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea, and now it is in a museum in Amman, behind glass, asking a quiet question of everyone who leans close enough to read it. Not where is the gold, but what did they believe was worth writing in metal? That question has an answer that does not require any further excavation. You are in contact with it tonight, in the simple fact that you are here, and the words are here, and the distance between them has been crossed. The treasure was always the transmission. The gold was always the fact that someone cared enough to seal it in something that would last beyond themselves. Sleep now. The copper scroll has been keeping its secret for 2,000 years. It is very good at waiting. And the most important treasures are never the ones buried in the ground. They are the ones carried forward, carefully, from one generation to the next, through the ordinary faithfulness of people who did not know how long the carrying would take. Chapter 9. What the Scrolls Say About Jesus. There is a question that follows the Dead Sea Scrolls everywhere they go. It is not always asked out loud. Sometimes it sits in the back of the room during academic lectures, politely unacknowledged. Sometimes it is the first thing a person asks when they hear about the scrolls for the first time, before they know enough to know how complicated the answer is. Sometimes it surfaces in the middle of the night, in the quiet space between waking and sleep, when the defenses that keep difficult questions at a manageable distance have lowered themselves. The question is this: what do the Dead Sea Scrolls say about Jesus? It is the right question to ask, and it deserves a complete and honest answer, including the part of the answer that popular treatments of the scrolls often leave out. So, let us begin there. Over the decades, since the scrolls were first published, a number of popular writers have claimed, with considerable excitement, that the scrolls do, in fact, contain direct references to Jesus, to John the Baptist, and to the early Christian movement, hidden under code names and symbolic titles. These claims generated best-selling books, documentary films, and a great deal of public interest in the 1980s and 1990s. The most widely read theories argued that figures mentioned in the scrolls, the teacher of righteousness and his opponents, could be identified with specific New Testament figures if you read the texts through the right interpretive lens. These claims did not generate scholarly consensus. The overwhelming majority of Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, working across decades and across different theological traditions, have found these identification theories unconvincing. They are compelling to read. They are also, on careful examination, unsupported by the evidence that scholars across decades and traditions have found in the texts themselves. The community at Qumran was its own community, with its own theology, its own grievances, its own understanding of what God was doing in the world, existing before and during, and in its final years roughly contemporary with the earlier stages of Jesus' public ministry. The scrolls do not mention Jesus. That is the honest starting point. But if that absence is where your investigation stops, you will miss something more significant than a direct reference could ever be. What the scrolls do, with a thoroughness and a specificity that continues to reshape the academic study of Christian origins decades after their discovery, is show us the world, the exact world, the specific religious landscape of first-century Judea, The vocabulary and the imagery and the theological categories and the urgent hopes and the deep anxieties of the people among whom Jesus lived and taught and died. They show us what the air was made of. And when you understand what the air was made of, everything Jesus said begins to breathe differently. Let us start with language, because language is where the most precise and most compelling connections are found. The Gospel of John is the New Testament document most deeply saturated in the kind of language found throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before the scrolls were discovered, scholars who noticed the distinctive vocabulary of John's Gospel had a limited set of explanations available to them. Some argued that John's language reflected Greek philosophical influence, particularly the concept of the logos from Platonic and Stoic traditions. Some argued that it represented a late 2nd century development, a theological elaboration on the simpler faith of the earlier Gospels, which would place it well outside the 1st century Palestinian Jewish world. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed both of those arguments permanently. The language that appears throughout John's Gospel, the stark contrast between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, the children of light and the children of darkness, the spirit of truth and the spirit of error, love within the community set against the hostility of the world outside. This language does not come primarily from Greek philosophy. It comes from the Hebrew religious world of Second Temple Judaism. It appears with striking frequency and in strikingly similar forms. In the texts, the Qumran community was reading and organizing their lives around in the decades before and during Jesus' ministry. The community rule contains a passage that scholars call the Treatise on the Two Spirits. It describes two spirits that God placed in humanity at the moment of creation. The spirit of truth leads toward light, toward righteousness, toward the covenant. The spirit of falsehood leads toward darkness, toward wickedness, toward destruction. Every human being is under the influence of both, in varying proportions, until the final moment when the spirit of truth prevails entirely. Now read the opening of John's Gospel. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And later, where Jesus prays for his disciples, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. The structural similarity is not a coincidence of translation. The Hebrew originals of the Qumran texts and the Greek original of John's Gospel are working with the same conceptual architecture. This does not mean John borrowed directly from the Qumran community. It means something more organic and more interesting. It means that this language was alive in 1st century Judea. It was in the air. It was part of the vocabulary available to any Jewish teacher or writer of the period who wanted to describe the relationship between God and human beings in terms of ultimate allegiance. When Jesus said, I am the light of the world, he was not introducing a foreign concept into the religious vocabulary of his audience. He was taking a concept they already held, a concept they had been meditating on and praying about and organizing their communities around, and making a claim about himself in relation to it. A claim that was comprehensible precisely because the vocabulary already existed, and a claim that was radical precisely because of what it asserted within that vocabulary. The second major connection involves the concept of the New Covenant. The Hebrew phrase Berit Hadashah, meaning New Covenant, appears in the Damascus document, one of the most significant texts in the Qumran collection, where the community describes itself as those who have entered the New Covenant. The phrase is drawn from the prophet Jeremiah, who had promised that God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel, written not on stone tablets, but on the hearts of the people. The Qumran community believed they were the living embodiment of that new covenant. They had left the corrupt institutions of Jerusalem. They had organized themselves around the purest possible interpretation of the law. When Jesus, at the Last Supper, took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," he was speaking in a language his audience already held. not introducing the concept, making a claim about its fulfillment in a form and through a means that would take the rest of human history to fully understand. The third connection is perhaps the most intimate. The phrase "poor in spirit," which appears in the first beatitude of the Sermon on the Mount, has a direct parallel in the Qumran hymns known as the Hodayot, or thanksgiving hymns. The Hodayot use a Hebrew phrase that translates as the poor of spirit to describe the members of the community, those who have emptied themselves of pride and self-sufficiency and placed themselves entirely in God's hands. The Beatitude is not simply a statement about economic poverty. It is a statement about a specific posture before God, a posture that the Qumran community had articulated and practiced and written hymns about in the decades before Jesus walked up a hillside in Galilee and opened his mouth. He was speaking a language they had been learning. What follows is not a scholarly conclusion. It is a reflection, and it belongs to anyone who holds both of these traditions with care. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not an argument for Christianity. They are not evidence for or against the resurrection. They cannot answer the theological questions that matter most to people of faith, and they do not try to. What they are is the ground, the specific, historically particular, linguistically precise ground in which the seeds of the New Testament were planted. They show you the soil, and the soil, it turns out, was extraordinarily rich, full of language and hope and imagery and longing that had been cultivated for centuries by people who believed, with everything they had, that God was going to do something new in the world. They were right about that. What they could not have predicted was the form the newness would take. The scrolls are the reaching, the New Testament is the arriving, and the connection between them is not a challenge to either. It is the evidence of a conversation that was already in progress when Jesus walked into it and said something that changed everything. There is a prayer in the Hodayot that reads, in translation, "I thank you, Lord, because you have placed me at the source of flowing streams, beside the springs of water, in a dry land. You have set me beside a plantation of trees, an Eden watered from a hidden spring." It was written by someone who lived in the desert, who knew what it meant to be thirsty, who had found, in the community and the texts and the daily practice of the faith they had chosen, something that satisfied a thirst the ordinary world had not been able to meet. And in writing about what they had found, they were preparing a language for someone who would come after them and say, to anyone who was thirsty, "Come to me and drink." The scrolls did not predict Jesus, but they prepared the words, and that is a different kind of miracle, not the kind that happens once in a dramatic moment, the kind that happens slowly, across centuries, through the ordinary faithfulness of people who kept writing and copying and praying and sealing jars, without knowing exactly what they were preparing for. Chapter 10. The Men Who Spent Their Lives on Fragments. Every great discovery requires two kinds of courage. The first kind is the courage of the finding, the dramatic moment, the thrown stone, the opened cave, the object lifted from the dark into the light. This is the courage that gets remembered, that becomes the story told in museums and documentaries and books written for general audiences. It is real courage when it exists, but it is also by its nature brief. The moment of discovery ends. The second kind of courage is quieter and longer and much harder to sustain. It is the courage of the understanding. The years, sometimes the decades, of painstaking work that transforms a found object into a known one. The patience required to sit with a fragment no larger than a thumbnail and determine, from 2 or 3 legible characters and the texture of the leather and the angle of the scribal hand, which manuscript it belongs to and where in that manuscript it fits, and what it says and what that means. The Dead Sea Scrolls required both kinds of courage, but it is the second kind that made the discovery into what it became. And the story of the scholars who devoted their lives to that work deserves more attention than it usually receives. When the first scrolls reached the academic world in the late 1940s, the field of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship did not exist. It had to be invented. The scholars who were handed the responsibility of studying and publishing the texts were experts in related fields, but none of them had been trained for this specific task because the task had never existed before. The man given primary responsibility for organizing the scholarly team was a Dominican friar and archaeologist named Roland de Vaux. He led the excavations at Qumran and assembled the international team that would work on the scroll fragments, particularly the enormous Cave 4 collection. They worked in a room at the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem that became known as the Scrollery, long tables under controlled lighting where fragment after fragment was laid out, examined, photographed, and painstakingly matched with other fragments to reconstruct manuscripts that had shattered into dozens or hundreds of pieces over 2,000 years. The work was slow in a way that is difficult to convey. You could not rush it. Rushing produced errors, and errors in this work were not recoverable. The patience required was not the patience of waiting for something to happen. It was the active, disciplined patience of a person who has made a commitment to a standard of accuracy that will not bend regardless of how long the process takes. The scholars also worked without the tools that later generations would take for granted. No digital imaging, no multispectral photography that could reveal characters invisible to the naked eye, no database software. They worked with the naked eye, with photographs taken under controlled raking light, with handwritten notes on index cards, with the accumulated knowledge in their own heads of the paleographic styles and scribal conventions of the Second Temple period. Some of them spent years on a single manuscript, years of daily work, of incremental progress, of the specific satisfaction that comes from placing a fragment correctly and seeing the text become, for the first time in 2,000 years, legible again. John Strugnell was a British scholar who joined the Cave 4 team as a young man in the 1950s. He was, by the accounts of those who worked with him in his prime, extraordinarily gifted. His knowledge of Second Temple Jewish texts was encyclopedic. His ability to read damaged and fragmentary Hebrew and Aramaic was exceptional even by the standards of a demanding field. He rose to become the chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project, the person ultimately responsible for overseeing the publication of the Cave 4 texts. He spent 4 decades on the scrolls. 4 decades of that second kind of courage, the quiet, daily work of understanding, sitting with fragments and making meaning out of what remained. And then, in 1990, he gave an interview to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, in which he made a series of statements that were widely condemned as deeply offensive. He was removed from his position. The controversy overshadowed, in the public record, the 4 decades of scholarship that had preceded it. He died in 2012. The obituaries mentioned both things. His story is not a comfortable one. It does not resolve into a simple lesson. It is the story of a human being who was capable of extraordinary dedication and extraordinary failure simultaneously, as human beings tend to be, whose life's work was entangled with both in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. But the work exists. The fragments that he spent decades placing correctly are placed correctly. The texts that he worked to make legible are legible. 4 decades of daily patience are present in the published volumes that scholars still use today. The work outlasted the man. That is what work at this level does. It becomes part of something larger than the person who did it, something that does not depend on the person's consistency or eventual judgment in order to remain true. By the 1980s, more than 30 years after the Cave 4 fragments had been recovered, a significant portion of them remained unpublished and inaccessible to scholars outside the original team. The frustration in the wider scholarly community became something closer to outrage. Here was arguably the most significant collection of ancient Jewish texts ever discovered. and access to a substantial portion of it was controlled by a small group moving at a pace that could charitably be described as unhurried. The situation changed in 1991 through a combination of scholarly pressure and a decision by the Huntington Library in California, which had obtained a set of photographs of the unpublished fragments and chose to make them available to researchers. The Israel Antiquities Authority then opened access more broadly. Once the photographs were available, the pace of scholarship accelerated dramatically. New connections were made. New questions were asked. The collection that had been partly locked away was suddenly available to the full range of expertise that the academic world could bring to bear on it. Today, every fragment in the collection has been photographed using multispectral imaging that reveals details invisible to the naked eye. Every image is available online through the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library, accessible to anyone in the world with an internet connection. A student anywhere on Earth can examine the same fragments that Roland DeVoe's team handled in the scrollery in Jerusalem in the 1950s. In higher resolution and with more analytical tools than the original scholars had available. The text that was sealed in darkness for 2,000 years is now, in a very real sense, more visible than it has ever been. There is a woman named Caroline. She is 31 years old and a doctoral student in ancient Near Eastern studies at a university in Chicago. She grew up in a small town in Mississippi where nobody she knew had heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. She encountered them for the first time in an undergraduate course and felt, she said, like a door had opened in a wall she had not known was there. She is currently working on a dissertation that uses multispectral imaging data from the Leon Levy Digital Library to analyze scribal hands in the Cave 4 fragments, attempting to identify individual scribes across multiple manuscripts to understand how the copying work at Qumran was organized and distributed. She works on the same fragments that Strugnell spent 4 decades on. She has tools he did not have. She is asking questions that would not have been possible to ask until the images were made publicly available. She told her advisor last year that the thing she loves most about the work is the handwriting, that each scribe had a distinctive hand, small habits of letter formation that were as individual as a fingerprint, that after enough time with a particular hand, you begin to recognize it. You begin to feel, she said, like you know someone. Someone who has been dead for 2,000 years, who sat in a room above the Dead Sea and copied texts by lamplight, and whose individual handwriting survived in fragments no larger than a thumbnail, waiting to be recognized by a graduate student from Mississippi. The work of understanding passes from one set of hands to another. From DeVoe's team in the scrollery to the scholars who fought for access to Caroline in her office in Chicago, leaning toward a screen, recognizing a hand that has been waiting 2,000 years to be known. That continuity is itself a kind of testimony to the conviction that certain things are worth the full effort of human attention, that a fragment of text, 2,000 years old, deserves the same care and patience that a fragment of anything worth keeping deserves. The scrollery is quiet tonight. The fragments are in their cases. The digital images are waiting for morning researchers who will come back to the same questions tomorrow, carrying the work forward, one careful observation at a time. And somewhere in Chicago, a young woman from Mississippi is doing the same thing the scribe did, in the same spirit if not the same room, recognizing the marks that a human hand made when it was trying to preserve something worth preserving. The light in that chain has not gone out. Chapter 11. The Psalms Scroll. Words you already know, older than you thought. There is a particular kind of recognition that has no adequate name in English. It is not surprise, though it contains surprise. It is not comfort, though it contains comfort. It is the feeling of encountering something you have known all your life and discovering, without warning, that it is older and deeper and more widely traveled than you had any reason to expect. The feeling of finding out that the words you heard at your grandmother's funeral, or at a bedside vigil, or in a church on a Sunday morning when you were 7 years old and did not yet understand what the words meant, but knew they mattered, have been traveling toward that moment for a very long time. Longer than you thought. Much longer. In 1956, in the last of the 11 caves above Qumran, archaeologists found a scroll that would produce that feeling in more people than almost any other document in the collection. Cave 11 yielded a scroll of Psalms, not fragments. A substantial scroll containing 49 Psalms, some of them complete, others partial, preserved well enough to be read without reconstruction. The scroll is approximately 4 meters long, written on 7 sheets of leather stitched together with linen thread. The scribal hand is clear and even, the work of someone whose fingers knew the shapes of these letters, the way a musician's fingers know the notes of a piece they have played for years. The scroll dates to the 1st century of the Common Era, approximately 2,000 years ago, placing it in the final decades of the Qumran community's existence. Among the psalms it contains is Psalm 23. The same words, written on leather by a hand that has been dust for 2,000 years, in a cave above the Dead Sea, sealed in the dark, while Jerusalem fell, and the temple burned, and the world that had produced it was swept away. The Lord is my shepherd. Those 4 words, in the Hebrew of the 1st century of the Common Era, in the handwriting of a scribe whose name we will never know, sitting in a cave in the Judean desert for 2,000 years, waiting, I shall not want. There is a woman named Dorothy. She is 73 years old, and she lives in a small house in rural Georgia, where she has lived for 40 years. She has buried a husband and a son and 2 sisters, and at each of those funerals Psalm 23 was read. She has heard it so many times that she can hear the voice of each person who read it at each of those services when she thinks of it now, layered one over the other like transparencies. The same words in different voices, in different rooms, in different decades of her life. She heard about the Cave 11 Psalm scroll in a radio program 3 years ago. She pulled over to the side of the road and sat in the car until the program was finished. She said to her daughter that evening, "Those words were lying in a cave in the desert, while every person I ever loved was being born and living and dying. They were there the whole time, just waiting to be found again." Her daughter asked, "Does that change what they mean to you?" Dorothy thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "It makes them feel like they were meant to survive, like somebody knew they were going to be needed." The Cave 11 scroll does not contain the Psalms in the order that modern Bibles present them. The sequence is different, arranged in a way that scholars have debated for decades. Some believe the different order reflects a liturgical arrangement, the Psalms organized for use in worship rather than for reading in sequence. Others believe it reflects a text tradition in which the ordering had not yet fully stabilized. The discussion continues. What the different ordering tells us is that the collection of psalms we call the Psalter was, in the 1st century of the Common Era, still in a period of final definition. The question of which psalms belonged and in what sequence were questions that had not yet been answered, with the finality they would eventually achieve. And this is where the Cave 11 scroll becomes most extraordinary. Among the 49 psalms it contains, 8 are not found in any standard biblical collection. They exist in this scroll and in a handful of other ancient sources, and nowhere else. One of them is known as Psalm 151. It is a short poem, written in the first person, in which a young shepherd describes his call by God to be anointed king. The content is clearly connected to the story of David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, who was called out of the fields while his older brothers watched. This psalm is not entirely unknown to the Christian tradition. It is accepted as canonical by Eastern Orthodox communities, including Greek Orthodox, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches, which have included it in their versions of the Psalter for centuries. For Christians in those traditions, finding it in the Dead Sea Scrolls was a confirmation of something ancient. For the majority of Western Christians, for whom the Psalter ends at Psalm 150, it was a window into the breadth of the tradition before the boundaries were finalized. The Cave 11 scroll also contains the Great Hallel, the collection of psalms used in Jewish worship during the Passover meal. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that after the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn before going out to the Mount of Olives. Jewish liturgical practice of the period is clear about what hymn was sung after the Passover meal. It was the Hallel, Psalms 113 through 118. The last thing Jesus and his disciples did before going out to Gethsemane was sing psalms from a tradition that the Cave 11 scroll preserves. The same words, the same tradition, the same community of ancient hymn writers whose work had been traveling through the hands of copyists for centuries, arriving at an upper room in Jerusalem on the night before the crucifixion, still being sung. That continuity is almost impossible to hold in your mind all at once. You can only hold one piece of it at a time. One scribe, one jar, one cave, one scroll, one set of words sung in an upper room before everything changed. But the chain is real, and the Cave 11 scroll is one of its visible links. There is a man named William. He has been a cantor in a conservative Jewish synagogue in New Jersey for 22 years. His voice is the primary instrument through which his congregation hears the Psalms week after week, year after year, in the Hebrew that has been the language of that worship for 3,000 years. He spent a Shabbat afternoon with the images of the Cave 11 scroll on his laptop, reading the familiar texts in an unfamiliar hand on ancient leather. He said to his wife that evening, the tradition held. All those centuries of copying and translating and arguing and losing texts and finding them again, the tradition held. She said, "You sound surprised." He said, "I sound grateful." There is a difference, he said, between knowing that something has been preserved and seeing the preservation. Seeing it in the actual ink, on the actual leather, in the actual handwriting of an actual person who was doing the same work 2,000 years ago that I am doing now. The work of transmission is not glamorous work. It is not the work that gets celebrated in public. It does not have the drama of discovery or the intellectual excitement of analysis. It is the work of showing up, day after day, and doing the same thing of mun that was done yesterday and will be done tomorrow, trusting that the repetition is not emptiness but accumulation, that each time the words are spoken or sung or copied, they go a little deeper into the fabric of what will survive. William has been doing that work for 22 years in New Jersey. The scribe in Cave 11 was doing it 2,000 years ago above the Dead Sea. The monks in Ethiopia were doing it in their mountain monasteries across 15 centuries. Dorothy has been receiving the words at funerals and sitting with them in her car on the side of a road in Georgia. James has been writing them into letters for his children in a folder on his desk in Nashville. The line runs through all of them, and it runs through you. Tonight, let the words be new again. Let them be what they were when a scribe in the 1st century of the Common Era dipped a pen into ink and formed each character carefully on a piece of prepared leather, knowing that what he was copying was true, not knowing that 2,000 years later someone would be hearing it in the dark. He makes me lie down in green pastures. You are lying down now. In whatever room you are in whatever part of the night you have reached, your body is finding its way toward rest. He leads me beside still waters. The waters are still tonight. The world outside is quiet. The ancient words are here. He restores my soul. Let that be true tonight. Let the oldest surviving copy of this psalm do what the psalm was always meant to do. Let it find the part of you that is tired and lead it somewhere quieter. Let it find the part of you that is afraid and sit with it until the fear becomes smaller than the peace. The scribe who wrote it is gone. The community that preserved it is gone. The cave that held it for 2,000 years still stands in the cliff above the Dead Sea, empty now, visited occasionally by people who lean into the low opening and try to imagine what it held. But the words are here. They made it. Through all of it, they made it. To you. Chapter 12. What they kept and why it matters tonight. We are near the end now, not the end of the night, necessarily. The night will do what it needs to do and find its own end in its own time. But we are near the end of this particular journey. This walk, through 11 caves and 900 manuscripts and 2,000 years of preservation and loss and recovery, that began with a teenage shepherd and a stone thrown into the dark. Before we arrive at the final resting place of this night, there is one more question to sit with. The question that all of this has been building toward, in the way that long journeys build toward the moment when you finally stop walking and turn around and see how far you have come. The question is not historical. It is not scholarly. It cannot be answered by paleography or carbon dating or multispectral imaging or any of the other tools that have transformed the study of the scrolls over 70 years. The question is this: what did they keep, and why does it matter tonight? Let us think about the first part carefully, because the answer is not as obvious as it might seem. The community at Qumran kept texts. The books of the Hebrew Bible, almost all of them, in multiple copies, in careful scribal hands, in jars designed to protect them from the desert and the centuries. They kept their own community texts, the rules and hymns and commentaries and apocalyptic visions that organized their common life. They kept texts from the broader tradition of Second Temple Judaism, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. Other documents that had not made it into the eventual biblical canon but were clearly important to them. They kept words, not gold, not weapons, not the kind of material wealth that most communities, under existential threat, prioritize when they have to choose what to save. They kept words. That choice tells you everything about what they believed. They believed that the most important thing they possessed was not anything that could be worn or spent or used as leverage in the political negotiations of the moment. It was the accumulated testimony of their tradition, the record of what God had said and done and promised in the history of their people, the framework of understanding within which their own lives made sense. Take that away and they were just people in a desert. Keep it and they were the continuation of a story that had been in progress since the beginning of the world. So they kept it. They wrapped it in linen. They sealed it in clay. They carried it up a cliff face at the end of everything they had known and hid it in the dark. And then the question becomes, why does that matter to you tonight? In whatever room you are in whatever circumstances have brought you to the end of this particular day, think about what the community at Qumran was doing in the final years before the Roman army arrived. They were surrounded by a world that was falling apart. The political structures that had organized Jewish life for generations were collapsing under Roman pressure. The temple establishment they had left Jerusalem to protest was itself about to be destroyed. Everything external to them was in the process of becoming unrecognizable, and they kept doing what they had always done. They kept copying. They kept praying before dawn. They kept sharing the communal meal in the evening. They kept following the rhythms of the sacred calendar, Sabbath after Sabbath, feast day after feast day, in the desert settlement that was all they had left of the life they had chosen. They did not abandon their practices because the circumstances no longer supported them. They did not decide that the urgency of the crisis justified setting aside the discipline of the ordinary days. They kept doing the small faithful things because they understood, at some level, that did not require articulation, that the small faithful things were not preparation for something more important. They were themselves the most important thing. The emet. We encountered that word at the very beginning of this night, in the first chapter of this long journey. The word that means truth but reaches deeper than truth. Firmness, reliability, The quality of being present in the same way, in the same place, doing the same faithful thing, regardless of what the circumstances around you are doing. The emet of the jars that kept the scrolls for 2,000 years. The emet of Muhammad ed-Dib who climbed because following was what you did when something wandered off. The emet of the Masoretic scribes who counted every letter across 1,000 years of hand copying. The emet of Caroline who leans toward her screen and recognizes a hand that has been waiting 2,000 years. The emet of William who sings the Hallel every Shabbat morning in New Jersey. The emet of Dorothy who pulled over to the side of a road in Georgia because she needed to finish listening to something that mattered. The emet of James who sealed his letters in a folder on his desk and called it a jar, who understood from the people of Qumran that sealing things carefully is how hope moves through time. The emet that runs through all of it, from the lamplight room in Qumran to this quiet room where you are resting now, is not a grand heroic faithfulness. It is not the faithfulness of people who knew they were making history. It is the faithfulness of people who simply could not find a reason to stop. That is the emet the community at Qumran kept, not in the jars, in themselves. The jars were just the last act of a faithfulness that had been going on for 200 years, one ordinary morning at a time. And when the jar was sealed and the cave was dark and the Roman army was on the road from Jericho, the emet was still there. In the clay, in the linen, in the leather, in the ink, still there. There is a woman named Anna. She is 36 years old and she works night shifts in a hospital in Minneapolis. She has worked nights for 9 years, which means she has spent 9 years living in a different relationship to time than most of the people she knows. She finds the nights hardest, not because of the work, but because of the quiet in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the ward is still and there is time to think. Those are the hours when the accumulation of what she has seen, all the suffering and the loss, and the occasional grace that a hospital contains, sits most heavily. She started listening to night psalms on those shifts, walking the quiet corridor with her phone in her pocket, the words coming through her earpiece in the hours when the rest of the world was asleep. She found something in the long, careful telling of ancient stories that shorter forms of comfort could not provide. Not an answer to the things she had seen, not a resolution of the weight she carried, but a context. A sense of being inside a story, larger than the particular story of any single night, a story that had been going on for a very long time and would continue going on after this night was over. She told a colleague once that what she appreciated most was that the stories did not pretend the darkness was not dark. They sat in it honestly and found something that was not quite comfort, but was perhaps more durable. She called it company. She is right. That is what the ancient texts provide, at their best. Not escape from the darkness, but company in it. The testimony of people who had sat in their own darkness and found the words to say something true about it. People who had kept the emet when keeping it was hard, when the world around them was doing everything it could to make keeping it impossible, and who had passed the words forward to the next person who needed them. The people of Qumran kept the words because the words were true, because the truth of the words did not depend on whether the people who kept them were safe or successful or recognized, because some things are worth keeping regardless of what keeping them costs. That conviction is alive tonight. It is alive in Caroline in Chicago, leaning toward her screen and recognizing a scribal hand from 2,000 years ago. It is alive in William in New Jersey, singing the Hallel on Shabbat morning. It is alive in Anna in Minneapolis, walking the quiet corridor at 3 in the morning with ancient words in her ear. It is alive in Dorothy in Georgia, who pulled over to the side of a road to finish listening to something that mattered. It is alive in James in Nashville, who sealed a folder of letters for his daughter and called it a jar because he understood that sealing things carefully is how hope moves through time. And it is alive in you tonight. In whatever way it is alive in you, However, you have arrived at this hour and this quiet and this willingness to follow a long story all the way to its end. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not the answer to every question. They are not a proof of any particular theological claim. They are not a solution to the complexity and the grief and the ordinary difficulty of being a human being in a world that does not always make it easy to hold on to what matters. What they are is evidence. Evidence that what matters has been considered worth keeping by people in circumstances far more desperate than yours. Evidence that the words that carry the deepest truths about the relationship between God and human beings have been handled with extraordinary care across extraordinary distances of time. Evidence that the darkness does not get the last word, not because the darkness is not real, but because there have always been people willing to seal the jar and carry it up the cliff face and trust it to whatever comes next. You are the whatever comes next. You are the person those jars were sealed for, without anyone knowing it. You are the reader the scribes were writing for, without any of them having met you. You are the reason the words were worth counting, and the count has not lost track of where you are. Think about the stone one last time. The stone that Muhammad Hib threw into a cave on an ordinary morning in 1947. He was not looking for sacred texts. He was a 15-year-old boy looking for a lost goat, and he threw a stone into the dark because that is what you do when you are not sure what is inside something. The scrolls that answered his stone had been waiting 2,000 years for exactly that kind of ordinary, unintentional action. Not a scholar with the right credentials, not a believer with the right faith, not a hero with the right courage. A boy with a stone and a lost goat and a moment of casual curiosity about what was in the dark. Pay attention to the thrown stones in your own life. The offhand question that opened a door you had not been looking for. The book you picked up because something caught your eye. The conversation you had with someone you were not trying to have a conversation with. The moment of ordinary attention that became, without announcing itself, the beginning of something that mattered. The scrolls did not know when they would be found. They only waited, in the dark, in the sealed jars, trusting that the person who needed them would eventually come. That the emet of the jars would hold long enough for the emet of a shepherd boy to complete the circuit. It held, for 2,000 years, and it is holding still.
Let us pray. Father, we come to the end of a long night and a long journey together. We have walked through caves and university offices and hospital corridors at 3 a.m, and an elderly woman's car pulled over on the side of a road in Georgia. We have held fragments smaller than a thumbnail and scrolls 7 meters long. We have heard the sound of pottery breaking in the dark and the sound of psalms being sung in a desert settlement before dawn, and the sound of a cantor's voice on a Shabbat morning, carrying words across 3,000 years of Samen, faithful repetition. And now we are still. Father, the things we have carried through this night are things you already know. You were there when the jars were sealed. You were there in the cave during the 2,000 years of silence. You were there when the stone was thrown, and the pottery broke, and the linen-wrapped scrolls came into the light for the first time since the Roman army was on the road from Jericho. You were there when Psalm 23 was copied onto leather by a scribe who formed each character carefully, not knowing that a woman in Georgia would hear about it one day and pull over to the side of the road because she needed to finish listening. You were there when James sat at his desk in Nashville and wrote letters to people he loved and sealed them in a folder and called it a jar. You were there for all of it. Every cave, every fragment, every scribe, every morning prayer before dawn in the desert, every evening meal with bread and wine and blessing, every ordinary act of faithfulness by people who did not know they were making history and were only trying to keep the Emet alive for one more day. You were there, and you are here now, in this room, in this hour, with this particular person who has followed this long story all the way to its end. Father, we ask tonight for the Emet, not the dramatic kind, not the heroic kind, the ordinary kind, the firmness that shows up one more morning when showing up is hard, the reliability that keeps the practice when the practice feels small, the quality of being present to what we say we believe day after day without needing the day to be exceptional in order to be faithful in it. We do not know what we are preserving by living this way. We do not know who will find what we seal up and carry carefully and trust to whatever comes next. We do not know whether the jars we make will hold for 2 years or 2,000. We only know that the making and the carrying and the trusting are ours to do. So, give us that, Father. Give us the willingness to do what is ours to do without needing to see the full shape of what it is building toward. Give us the dawn prayer when the dawn is cold. Give us the communal meal when the sharing is costly. Give us the copied letter and the kept promise and the daily practice that does not announce itself and does not require an audience. Give us the courage of the second kind, the quiet kind, the long kind, the kind that sits with fragments and gives them years, the kind that climbs a cliff face in the dark with a jar full of words and trusts the mountain to keep what cannot be kept any other way. And when we seal the jars and carry them up and trust them to the dark, give us the peace of knowing that the dark is not the end of the story. It never was. We thank you for the boy who threw the stone. We thank you for the desert that preserved what the desert preserved. We thank you for Roland DeVoe and John Strugnell and Caroline in Chicago and everyone who has given years to fragments that could not be rushed. We thank you for William, whose voice carries the Psalms forward every Shabbat morning in New Jersey. We thank you for Dorothy, who pulled over on the road in Georgia and sat in her car until she had finished listening. We thank you for James, who understood that sealing things carefully is how hope moves through time. We thank you for Anna, walking the quiet corridor at 3 in the morning with ancient words in her ear, keeping the Emmet alive in a hospital ward while the rest of the world sleeps. We thank you that the words arrived, that they arrived here, that they arrived in this room, at this hour, to this particular person who followed the story all the way to the end. Guard their sleep tonight, Father. Let the ancient words do in them what ancient words do best. The quiet work that happens below the level of attention, the settling of truth into places too deep for the waking mind to reach on its own. Let them wake tomorrow, carrying a little more of the Emmet than they carried when this day began. A little more willing to do the daily work without needing the daily reward. A little more at peace with the darkness, knowing that the darkness held those jars for 2,000 years and gave them back undamaged. The Lord is my shepherd. Let that be true tonight. Not as a doctrine, not as a theological proposition, just as a fact felt in the body, the way rest is felt, the way the moment of putting down a weight you have been carrying too long is felt. I shall not want. You are provided for, tonight and tomorrow, and in all the circumstances that tomorrow contains. The one who made the scrolls and preserved the scrolls, and opened the scrolls, and brought the words to you across 2,000 years of desert silence, has not lost track of you. He leads me beside still waters. The waters are still. The night is quiet. The long journey is over for now. He restores my soul. Rest now. The jars held. The words survived. The stone was thrown at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person, into exactly the right cave. And tonight, in this room, in this quiet, after 2,000 years of waiting, they reached you. Sleep well, beloved. The cave is empty now, and the scrolls are in the light, and you are held in the same Emmet that sealed the jars and kept them, and brought you here through all the unlikely hands of history. Through Jesus Christ, the one the ancient longing was reaching toward before it knew his name. To him be all glory, forever and ever. Amen. This is Night Psalms. The ancient words have found you. They always do. and we will go searching together again soon.